Part 1. John Carter stretched, feeling a familiar ache in his joints as he climbed out of his old pickup truck, parked in front of a small-town diner he'd frequented for years. The diner, a modest establishment with a weathered sign reading Millie's Place, held countless memories for John, who had once been a young soldier, fresh from training, looking forward to a long life ahead. His weathered face bore the quiet strength and dignity of a man who had endured hardship and pain for the sake of his country. He tugged his jacket tighter against a cool breeze and stepped toward the door. Inside, the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of frying bacon, and for a moment he felt a sense of peace. "Good morning, John." Millie's usual cheerful voice called out as he stepped in. Millie, a round, grandmotherly woman with a head of curly gray hair, always seemed to radiate warmth. "Good morning, Millie," he said, his lips curving into a gentle smile. As he made his way to his usual booth, he noticed the other patrons, many of whom he recognized, casting uneasy glances in his direction. John had seen those looks before, and he felt an uncomfortable chill settle over him. Something felt different today. But he shrugged it off, chalking it up to nothing more than his own nerves. Millie brought him his usual order of coffee and a slice of peach cobbler, giving him a quick wink as she set down the steaming mug. "Here you go, soldier," she said with a grin. He took a grateful sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth and comfort it provided, and lifted his fork to dig into his cobbler when he felt a shadow loom over him. John looked up, his brow furrowing as he saw Brad Kelsey, a man he knew well as Millie's son and the current manager of the diner. Normally Brad was friendly, even a little boisterous, but today his expression was unreadable, his jaw tight as he looked down at John. "Is there a problem, Brad?" John asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. "John, you're gonna have to leave," Brad said, his voice low and hard. He crossed his arms over his chest, his face set in a stubborn scowl. "I don't think you should be eating here anymore." The words felt like a slap, and John blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry. Did I do something wrong?" He glanced around at the other patrons, many of whom had averted their eyes, avoiding his gaze. The sense of discomfort he had felt earlier intensified. Brad took a step back, clearly wanting distance. "Look, it's nothing personal," he said, though his tone held no apology. "We just don't think you're, the right fit for this place." John felt his stomach twist, a cold knot forming as the truth behind Brad's words sank in. He had seen this kind of treatment before, but here, in his own town, from people he'd known for years, it hit differently. Millie, who had always welcomed him with open arms, had seemingly disappeared to the back, leaving him alone to face her son's hostility. "Brad, I don't understand. I've been coming here for years. Millie's always been kind to me. What's changed?" Brad's face twisted slightly, and he shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting away. "People change, John, and maybe it's time you find a new place to have your breakfast." The words were clipped, dismissive. For a moment, John considered pressing the issue, demanding an explanation. But then he felt the weight of the gazes around him, saw the judgment in people's eyes, and realized that arguing wouldn't change anything. Brad's mind was made up, and no amount of reasoning would change that. Slowly, John pushed his half-eaten plate aside, leaving a few dollars on the table. As he stood up, his heart heavy with disappointment and anger, he tried to ignore the stinging humiliation burning in his chest. This was the place he had come to every Saturday for years, the place he had brought his wife before she passed, the place that had felt like a second home. And now, in a matter of moments, it had turned into a reminder of the prejudice he thought he had left behind. John kept his head high as he walked toward the door, determined not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing his pain. Just as he reached the exit, a young woman who had been sitting near the counter, her face pale with shock, stood up. She glanced at Brad, then back at John, clearly torn. "This isn't right," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You can't treat him like this, Brad." Brad's face darkened, and he shot her a cold glare. "I run this diner. You don't like it, you can leave too." For a moment, the young woman hesitated, her hand shaking slightly as she looked from John to Brad. Then, with a resigned sigh, she sank back into her seat, her expression filled with shame. John gave her a small nod, a silent thank you for her attempt to stand up for him, even if it had failed. As he pushed open the door and stepped outside, the fresh air hit him, but it did nothing to wash away the bitter taste left by the morning's events. He walked slowly to his truck, feeling every step like a weight dragging him down. In the silence of his truck, John sat for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel as memories of his youth flooded back. Memories of discrimination and cold stares, of being told he wasn't welcome, of being treated as if he didn't belong. He thought of his years of service, the sacrifices he had made for his country, and how, even after all these years, he still wasn't accepted. But then something shifted inside him. His jaw set in a firm line, and a new determination sparked in his eyes. John Carter was many things: a veteran, a father, a survivor. But he was not a man who would let injustice go unanswered. As he pulled out of the diner's parking lot, a plan began to form in his mind. This was far from over. Brad Kelsey and his petty discrimination had awakened something in him, something that had lain dormant for far too long. By the time John reached his small, tidy home, he knew what he needed to do. His son, Michael, lived in Washington, D.C., and though he was a busy man, he had always been there for his father when it mattered. Michael wasn't just anyone. He was a U.S. Senator, well respected, and known for his work on civil rights and social justice issues. If anyone would understand the importance of standing up to prejudice, it was him. Taking a deep breath, John dialed his son's number. After a few rings, Michael's familiar voice filled his ear. "Dad?" Michael sounded surprised. "Everything all right?" "Hey, son," John began, his voice steady but laced with an edge of anger. "We need to talk. I've got something to tell you, something that happened today." As he recounted the events at the diner, Michael listened in silence, his anger growing with every word. By the time John finished, there was a hard edge to Michael's voice that John hadn't heard before. "Dad," Michael said firmly, "I'm coming down. This isn't something we can ignore. That man has no right to treat you like that, and he's about to learn a very hard lesson." John felt a wave of relief at his son's words, his shoulders relaxing slightly as the burden of his hurt lifted, replaced by a newfound hope. Together, he and Michael would face this injustice head-on. Brad Kelsey may have thought his actions were justified, but he was about to learn that prejudice, no matter how deep-seated, would not go unchallenged. As John ended the call, he felt a quiet strength settle over him, knowing that he wouldn't be fighting this battle alone. The events of that morning had opened old wounds, but they had also reminded him of the power he held within himself, and the power of a son determined to protect his father's dignity. This is the end of Part 1. Let me know if you'd like to continue to Part 2 or make any adjustments. Part 2. Michael Carter sat at his desk in Washington, D.C., a polished oak workspace piled with files on veterans' rights, community development initiatives, and speeches he was preparing for upcoming town halls. Though he was used to the rhythm of politics, nothing could prepare him for the call he'd just received from his father. The anger simmered within him as he pictured the events his father had described. John Carter was a man of quiet dignity, a man who had served his country with honor and pride, and to think of him being humiliated in his own hometown stirred something fierce within Michael. He felt a sense of injustice he hadn't felt in years, and he knew he had to act. After ending the call, Michael took a steadying breath. This wasn't just about his father. It was about the kind of town he'd grown up in, the place that shaped him and taught him the values he held dear. A place that was still struggling to break free of the shackles of prejudice. Michael knew that tackling this wouldn't be easy. The Kelseys were deeply rooted in the community, and the diner had been a fixture in town for generations. But none of that mattered now. If Brad Kelsey thought he could get away with his actions, he was in for a rude awakening. Picking up his phone again, Michael dialed the number of an old friend, Callum Pierce. Callum had been his best friend in high school, a man who had stayed in town, and was now the editor of the local newspaper, The Lantern. Callum answered on the second ring. Michael Carter. To what do I owe the pleasure? Callum's familiar voice came through the line, but as soon as he heard the tension in Michael's tone, he grew serious. What's wrong? Callum, it's my dad. Michael began, his voice steady but laced with controlled anger. I just got off the phone with him. Brad Kelsey humiliated him at Millie's place, refused him service, told him he wasn't welcome there. There was a pause, then a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Are you serious? John Carter. Callum sounded incredulous. Your dad is one of the kindest, most respected men in town. What in the world was Brad thinking? Michael gave a humorless chuckle. Brad was thinking exactly what you'd expect someone with his narrow-minded views to think. He thinks he can do whatever he wants and face no consequences. But I don't intend to let that happen. Callum was silent for a moment, then spoke with a note of resolve. Tell me what you need, Michael. I need you to get the word out. Don't make it sensational, just the facts. People need to know what happened, need to see what kind of man Brad Kelsey really is. Let them see how he treats a veteran who served this country, who served them. Consider it done, Callum replied. I'll talk to some of the witnesses who were there this morning. By tomorrow, the story will be everywhere in town. As he hung up, Michael felt a small surge of satisfaction, knowing that Callum would handle things on his end. But he knew this was just the beginning. The following morning, word of the incident at Millie's place had spread throughout town, much faster than even Michael had anticipated. Small groups of townspeople gathered in front of shops, on sidewalks, and in cafes, their voices low but tense as they discussed the shocking news. Many of them had known John Carter for years. He was a man who kept to himself, sure, but he was the kind of person you could always count on in times of need. People remembered how he had volunteered to help rebuild after the town flood years ago, how he had mentored the high school football team, how he never asked for anything in return. And now, to hear that he'd been treated so poorly by Brad Kelsey at the diner, well, it didn't sit right with anyone. Millie Kelsey herself had heard the news and was deeply troubled. She had built that diner from the ground up and welcomed all who entered with warmth and respect. But now, she realized, Brad's views were casting a dark shadow over her life's work. Brad, she said sternly, cornering him as he prepped for the breakfast shift. What in the world were you thinking? Brad, taken aback, set down the coffee pot he was holding and looked at his mother with irritation. Ma, I told you, I have the right to refuse service to anyone I want. Just because John Carter's some veteran doesn't mean he gets special treatment. That's nonsense, she replied, her tone icy. He's more than a veteran, Brad. He's a good man, and you humiliated him for no reason other than your own prejudices. Brad scoffed, rolling his eyes. You don't understand, Ma. People like him, they're the problem around here. Always looking for pity, thinking they're owed something. Don't you talk to me like that, she snapped, her voice quivering with anger. You are not the man I raised you to be. We built this diner to serve everyone in this town, and I won't have you ruining its reputation with your hatred. Millie's face softened, sadness overtaking her anger. You're tearing this place apart, Brad. Brad's eyes darkened, but he said nothing. Turning on his heel, he walked back into the kitchen, leaving his mother standing alone in the empty dining area, a weight of despair settling on her shoulders. Meanwhile, at the edge of town, John Carter sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. He had always been a man of quiet strength, but the events of the previous day had shaken him more deeply than he cared to admit. It wasn't just the humiliation, it was the realization that, even. Part 3. The morning sun rose over the small town, casting long shadows across the empty streets as John Carter stepped out onto his porch, greeted by a cool breeze. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the events at Millie's place over and over. It wasn't the first time he had faced prejudice, but the hurt felt sharper, more personal, coming from people he thought he knew. As he gazed out at the quiet neighborhood, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. The car door opened, and his son, Michael, stepped out, his expression as resolute as ever. John felt a swell of pride and gratitude at seeing his son, but there was an unspoken weight between them, a silent acknowledgement of the pain that had brought Michael back home. "Dad," Michael greeted, his voice filled with warmth and respect. "You all right?" John forced a small smile. "I've been better, but I'll live." Michael's jaw tightened. "We'll make sure this doesn't just get swept under the rug, Dad. I promise." The two men walked inside, where John poured his son a cup of coffee, the familiar ritual easing some of the tension. They sat at the kitchen table in silence for a moment, each man gathering his thoughts. Finally, Michael spoke, his tone steady but his gaze intense. "Dad, I've spoken with Callum Pierce from the Lantern. The town already knows what happened at the diner, and people are talking. Brad Kelsey's words have stirred up a lot of anger and sympathy for you." John took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around his coffee mug. "I didn't want to make a scene, Michael. I just wanted to have my breakfast, the same as I always do." Michael nodded. "I know. But this isn't just about breakfast, Dad. This is about respect. You've done more for this town than most people could ever imagine, and you deserve better than to be treated like that." Michael paused, his expression softening. "I want you to know I'm here, and we're going to handle this together." John's gaze dropped to the table, memories of his past flashing through his mind. He'd fought hard, both on the battlefield and back home, to build a life of integrity and resilience. But somehow, even after all he'd done, moments like this reminded him that respect could be fragile, easily broken by prejudice. "Michael, I don't want this to become a crusade," John said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I just want people to see me for who I am, not the color of my skin." Michael's eyes softened. "I understand, Dad. But sometimes, to make people see, we have to shine a light on things they'd rather ignore." John exhaled, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease as he met his son's steady gaze. In that moment, he knew that Michael's heart was in the right place. Though he worried about the path they were taking, he trusted his son's judgment. "All right, son. If you think this is the way, I'll stand with you," John said. Meanwhile, across town, the Lantern's latest article was already creating waves. Callum Pierce had kept his promise, writing a thoughtful but unflinching piece about the incident at Millie's place. He described John Carter not just as a decorated veteran, but as a humble, generous man who had given his time and energy to make the town a better place. The story struck a nerve, sparking a conversation that quickly took on a life of its own. At Millie's place, the atmosphere was tense. Many of the regular patrons had stopped coming in, and those who remained eyed Brad Kelsey with a mixture of discomfort and disapproval. Millie herself was heartbroken. The diner had been her pride and joy, her life's work, and now it was tainted by the actions of her own son. "Brad," Millie said one afternoon, her voice weary, "this can't go on like this. People aren't coming back, and they're talking about you in ways I never thought I'd hear. This diner means the world to me, and I won't let you ruin it." Brad stiffened, resentment flashing in his eyes. "You don't understand, meh. They'll come around. They're just making a fuss because that Carter guy has people fooled into thinking he's some kind of hero." Millie shook her head, her heart aching at the sight of her son's stubbornness. "John Carter is a hero, Brad. He fought for this country, for our freedom. What you did was wrong, and deep down, you know it." But Brad refused to listen. He was a man used to getting his way, and he wasn't about to back down now. In his mind, he was standing up for his beliefs, no matter how outdated or misguided they might be. As word of the article spread, John and Michael began receiving phone calls and visits from neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had read about what had happened. Some offered words of support, others apologized for not having spoken up sooner, but all of them expressed a deep sense of outrage and sadness at the prejudice that had marred their town. One evening, as John was locking up his house, he noticed a familiar figure walking up the driveway. It was Sarah Langston, the young woman who had stood up for him at the diner. She looked nervous but determined, her face pale in the dim light. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice wavering slightly, "I just wanted to come by and say I'm so sorry for what happened. I should have done more to stop it." John's heart softened as he looked at Sarah, seeing the guilt in her eyes. "You did what you could, Sarah, and it meant a lot to me that you stood up, even if it was only for a moment." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and she glanced down, wringing her hands. "I felt so helpless, Mr. Carter. I knew it was wrong, but I was afraid. Afraid of what people would say if I stood up to Brad." John placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes it takes a lot of courage just to say what you did. Don't be hard on yourself, Sarah. We all have moments when we wish we'd done more. What matters is that you recognized it. And you're here now." She looked up at him, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I want you to know that there are a lot of people in town who don't agree with what Brad did. People are talking, and they're angry. If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know." John nodded, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Thank you, Sarah. Just knowing I have people like you standing with me is more help than you know." As the days passed, tensions in town continued to rise. Millie's place became increasingly empty, the steady stream of customers dwindling to a trickle. Brad's reputation suffered as stories of his treatment of John spread, and even those who had once called him a friend began to distance themselves. Michael, meanwhile, was working tirelessly behind the scenes. He met with local activists, community leaders, and even members of the town council, urging them to take a stand against discrimination. He knew that change wouldn't come overnight, but he was determined to make his father's ordeal a catalyst for something greater. One afternoon, he gathered a group of like-minded townspeople at the local community center, where they discussed ways to raise awareness and foster understanding within the town. They planned events, organized educational workshops, and even talked about setting up a community fund to support veterans and their families. As the meeting drew to a close, an elderly man named Walter Finch stood up, his voice trembling with emotion. Walter had known John Carter for decades and had seen firsthand the sacrifices he had made for his country. "John Carter is a good man," Walter said, his voice echoing in the room. "He's always been there for this town, even when it didn't treat him right. If we don't stand up for him now, then what kind of town are we?" The room erupted in applause, and Michael felt a swell of hope as he looked around, seeing the determination in each person's face. The town might have its flaws, but there were good people here, people who wanted to do the right thing. Back at Millie's place, Brad was beginning to feel the consequences of his actions. The diner was nearly empty, his staff was demoralized, and even the suppliers had started to distance themselves, hesitant to be associated with the controversy. He was too stubborn to admit it, but a creeping sense of doubt had begun to gnaw at him. Late one night, after closing up, Brad sat alone at one of the booths, his hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee. He stared out the window, the empty parking lot reflected back at him, a stark reminder of the isolation he now felt. He thought of his mother, of how proud she had been when she'd opened the diner, and he wondered if she had ever imagined it would come to this. For the first time, he felt a pang of regret. The next morning, as he unlocked the doors, he found an envelope slipped under the door. Opening it, he was startled to find a letter from Michael Carter himself, offering him a chance to make amends. Brad clenched his jaw, his pride battling with a gnawing sense of shame. Part 4. The days following Michael Carter's letter were some of the loneliest of Brad Kelsey's life. For the first time, he found himself isolated, even in his own town. The The diner was nearly empty most days, his regulars now avoiding him. And even his own mother had distanced herself, spending more time with friends and less time at the diner. Millie didn't say much to Brad directly, but her disappointment was unmistakable. She was, after all, a woman who had prided herself on being kind to everyone in town, a quality she had hoped to pass on to her son. Brad, however, couldn't bring himself to respond to Michael's letter. The terms were clear. Michael was offering him a chance to make amends publicly, to apologize not just to John Carter but to the entire community for his actions. But Brad's pride, hardened over years of clinging to the old ways his father had taught him, held him back. As he sat in his office one afternoon, staring at the letter on his desk, he heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. The door opened, and Millie stepped inside, her expression tired and somber. "Brad," she began, taking a seat across from him. "We need to talk." He sighed, avoiding her gaze. "Ma, I know what you're going to say." "Maybe you do," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "But you need to hear it anyway. This diner was built on kindness, Brad. Your father and I, we built this place with the belief that everyone deserved a place to feel welcome. But what you did to John..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "It goes against everything we stand for." Brad's face flushed, a mixture of embarrassment and anger stirring within him. "Ma, it's more complicated than that. People like John think they're entitled to respect just because they fought in some war. That doesn't mean he has a right to be here if I don't want him to be." Millie's eyes flashed with a rare fire. "That some war you're talking about was Vietnam, Brad. Your father never served, but he always respected those who did. And John Carter didn't just serve. He came back and dedicated his life to making this town better. He's done more for us than you could ever imagine." Brad opened his mouth to protest, but Millie raised a hand, silencing him. "I've always believed in you, Brad. I've always believed you'd see the value of kindness, of treating people with respect, no matter who they are. But I don't know if I can keep believing in you if you refuse to make this right." Brad swallowed hard, his throat tight. He wanted to defend himself, to argue that he had the right to run the diner his way. But the words died on his lips. Seeing the hurt in his mother's eyes, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Regret. I don't know if I can apologize," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Millie sighed, her expression softening. "Brad, it's not about what you feel like doing. It's about what's right. Sometimes we have to do things that are hard, things we don't want to do, because it's the only way to move forward." She stood up, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Think about it, Brad. Think about the kind of man you want to be remembered as." With that, she left, closing the door quietly behind her. Brad sat alone in the silence, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Meanwhile, across town, the atmosphere was tense as Michael and John Carter attended a town hall meeting. News of Brad Kelsey's actions had reached far and wide, and the community had come together to discuss what had happened and to hear from both the Carters. The meeting was held in the old community center, a building that had seen generations of the town's history unfold within its walls. Michael stepped up to the podium, his father beside him, and looked out at the gathered crowd, noting the mix of familiar and unfamiliar faces. There were people of all ages, backgrounds, and walks of life, united in their desire to address the issue that had shaken their community. Michael began by recounting his father's service and his contributions to the town, reminding everyone of the sacrifices John had made, both abroad and at home. As he spoke, he could see heads nodding in agreement, and he felt a swell of pride in his father, who stood beside him with quiet dignity. "My father didn't ask to be treated like a hero," Michael said, his voice strong and steady. "He's never asked for anything, not even gratitude. But he deserves respect, just as every person in this town does. And when that respect is denied because of prejudice, it's not just my father who's affected, it's all of us." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, And Michael took a deep breath, continuing. "We're not here to shame anyone," he said, though he knew that Brad's actions had already been condemned by most in town. "But we are here to demand that every person in this community is treated with fairness and dignity. My father was humiliated, but he isn't asking for pity. He's asking for change." He stepped back, allowing John to approach the microphone. John hesitated for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the faces of people he had known for years, people who had welcomed him into their lives, and others who had, at times, kept their distance. "I won't pretend this hasn't hurt me," John began, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "But I've seen worse than this. I've faced things that make this look like a small bump in the road. What I want more than anything is to live in a town that stands up for what's right, a town that treats everyone with decency, no matter their background." He paused, his eyes shining with a quiet resolve. "I believe in this town. I believe in all of you. And I hope that together, we can make this place better, not just for me, but for everyone." The crowd erupted into applause, their support echoing through the hall. As Michael and John stepped back, several people approached them, offering words of encouragement and apologies on behalf of the town. Each handshake, each promise of support, felt like a balm on John's wounded pride, reminding him that he was not alone. Back at the diner, Brad was pacing his office, his mother's words still ringing in his ears. He glanced at the letter from Michael once more, reading it over, feeling the shame and bitterness rise within him. Part of him wanted to tear it up, to dig in his heels and refuse to give in. But a larger part of him, a part he'd long buried, felt the weight of his actions, the hurt he had caused not only to John Carter but to his mother and the community. Finally, he made a decision. Grabbing his jacket, he walked out of the diner and headed toward the community center, his steps heavy with reluctance. When Brad arrived, the town hall was still buzzing with activity, and heads turned as he entered. A hush fell over the room, and all eyes fixed on him, a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and expectation in their gazes. Brad could feel his heart pounding in his chest, and he took a shaky breath as he made his way toward the podium, where Michael and John still stood. He stopped a few feet away, meeting John's steady gaze. There was no anger in John's eyes, only a quiet strength and an unspoken challenge. Brad felt a pang of guilt, knowing that his pride had hurt a man who had only ever shown kindness. Taking another deep breath, he turned to the crowd, his voice trembling slightly. I know what I did was wrong," he began, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I acted out of anger and pride, and I let my own prejudices cloud my judgment. I'm sorry for what I did to Mr. Carter, and I'm sorry to all of you. I know I've hurt this community, and I can't undo that, but I want to try to make it right." There was a pause, the silence thick with expectation. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he added, "I hope you'll all give me a chance to prove that I can be better." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, John Carter stepped forward, extending his hand. Brad looked at it, his heart pounding, and after a moment's hesitation, he took it, feeling the weight of John's forgiveness in that simple gesture. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers a testament to the power of forgiveness and the possibility of change. In that moment, Brad felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he could become the man his mother had always believed he could be. As the town dispersed that evening, there was a feeling of unity in the air, a sense that they had faced a difficult truth together and emerged stronger for it. And for the first time in a long time, John Carter felt a sense of peace, knowing that his story had become a catalyst for change, not just for him, but for everyone in the community. That concludes Part 4. Let me know if you'd like to continue with Part 5, as the story moves toward reconciliation and healing. Part 5. The next morning, the town was still buzzing with the news of the town hall. Brad's public apology and the unexpected reconciliation between him and John Carter had shaken the community, leaving many with mixed feelings. For some, it was a step toward progress and healing. For others, particularly those who had harbored silent prejudices, it was a difficult moment of reckoning. John, however, awoke that morning feeling lighter than he had in years. For him, the public meeting had been a profound reminder of his own resilience and his belief in the goodness of his neighbors. As he sat at his kitchen table, sipping his coffee, he replayed the events of the previous night in his mind. The moment when Brad had extended his apology was one he hadn't expected, but it had given him a new sense of peace. Michael joined him at the table, his expression thoughtful. "Dad, I have to say, I didn't expect Brad to come forward like that," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "It took a lot for him to stand in front of everyone and own up to his actions." John nodded. "It did. People like Brad don't usually see their own faults, let alone admit them. But it's a start, and maybe he'll learn from this." They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in thought, until Michael spoke again. "I think it's time we do something more than just wait for people like Brad to change," he said. "I was thinking, maybe we could organize an event at the community center, something to bring people together. It would be a good way to remind everyone of the town's values." John looked at his son, seeing the passion in his eyes, and smiled. "I think that's a fine idea, son. This town could use a little healing." Over the next few days, Michael set to work, gathering a team of community leaders, teachers, and local business owners to organize the event. They decided on a theme of unity and understanding, aiming to create an open and inclusive space where people could discuss their differences, learn from one another, and celebrate the diversity within their town. Flyers were posted around town, and local businesses offered to sponsor refreshments and decorations. Millie herself volunteered to cater the event, hoping it might help repair her diner's damaged reputation. Her heart ached for her son, who was trying, but still struggling under the weight of his past actions. She hoped that the event would not only bring healing to the town, but also give Brad a chance to see the impact of his choices. As the day of the event approached, a sense of anticipation filled the air. Neighbors who had never spoken to one another were now stopping to chat, drawn together by the common desire to make the town a better place. When the day finally arrived, the community center was transformed. Colorful banners hung from the walls, tables were set up with refreshments, and chairs were arranged in circles, encouraging conversation. A stage was set up at the front, where local musicians would perform throughout the day, adding a warm and welcoming atmosphere. John and Michael arrived early, helping to set up chairs and greet the townspeople as they arrived. They were joined by Sarah Langston, the young woman who had initially stood up for John at the diner, who had become a close ally in their efforts to bring about change. As people gathered, John felt a swell of pride. This was his town, and seeing so many faces gathered together, all eager to learn and grow, filled him with a renewed sense of hope. Even Brad arrived, standing near the back with his mother, looking somewhat out of place but determined to show his support. When it was time to begin, Michael took the stage, his voice clear and confident as he welcomed everyone. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "Today, we're here to take a step forward, to leave behind old prejudices and create a community that values each and every one of us." He spoke about his father's legacy, about the sacrifices John had made and the contributions he'd given to the town, emphasizing the importance of respect and empathy in building a strong, unified community. As he spoke, he saw heads nodding in agreement, and he felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing that his words were reaching people. Then he invited John to speak. As John stepped up to the microphone, a hush fell over the crowd. He looked out at the sea of faces before him, some familiar, others new, and felt a warmth spread through him. "When I first moved to this town, I was just a young man, fresh from the war," he began. "I didn't have much, but I had a desire to build a life here, to be a part of something bigger than myself. And over the years, I've seen this town grow and change in ways I never could have imagined. I've seen kindness, I've seen resilience, and I've seen the strength of a community that cares for one another." He paused, his gaze resting briefly on Brad, who stood with his head bowed. But I also seen the damage that prejudice can cause. And I believe that if we are to grow as a community, we need to face those old hurts, to acknowledge them, and to move forward with compassion." There was a long, thoughtful silence, and then the crowd erupted into applause. John stepped back, feeling a sense of fulfillment as he took his seat beside Michael. As the event continued, townspeople mingled, sharing stories, laughter, and even tears. Old wounds were acknowledged, misunderstandings were addressed, and bonds were strengthened. It was a day of healing, one that left an indelible mark on everyone who attended. Brad stayed near the back for most of the day, feeling out of place but strangely uplifted by the atmosphere of unity and forgiveness. He watched as people approached John, offering words of admiration and gratitude, and he felt a pang of regret for the hurt he had caused. Slowly, he began to understand the depth of John's impact on the town, the ways in which he had quietly given to others, asking for nothing in return. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the community center, Brad finally worked up the courage to approach John. He felt his mother's gentle hand on his shoulder, a quiet encouragement that gave him the strength to take the last few steps toward the man he had wronged. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice low but steady, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. Again, I know I said it before, but seeing all of this today, seeing how people look up to you, I realize now that I was wrong. You deserve to be here, just as much as anyone else." John looked at Brad, his expression kind but serious. "Thank you, Brad. I appreciate that. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, and I hope you'll continue to keep an open mind." Brad nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. As the evening drew to a close, the town gathered around the stage for one last speech, delivered by Millie herself. She had always been a quiet presence in the community, but tonight she spoke with a wisdom and strength that silenced the crowd. "This diner, this community, it belongs to all of us," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "And it's up to us to protect it, to make sure that everyone who comes here feels like they belong. We can't change the past, but we can decide what kind of future we want to build." In the weeks following the Unity and Understanding event, the town felt different. There was a shift in the air, a quiet but powerful sense of change that touched every corner, from the grocery store to the local park, from the high school to the church. People were kinder, more considerate, more willing to listen. The townspeople had seen the pain of prejudice and had decided, collectively, to take a stand against it. For John Carter, the changes felt like a breath of fresh air. He had spent his life working hard, showing kindness to others without asking for recognition. But now, as he walked through town, he noticed the difference in how people treated him. Neighbors who had once barely nodded his way now stopped to chat, offering genuine words of gratitude and respect. His small house, once quiet and unassuming, became a gathering place for old friends and new, a symbol of the community's newfound solidarity. One morning, as John sat on his front porch enjoying the peaceful early light, he saw a familiar face walking up his driveway, Brad Kelsey. Though he'd seen Brad around town a few times since the event, this was the first time Brad had come to his home. John stood to greet him, sensing the purpose in Brad's steps. "Morning, Mr. Carter," Brad said, looking slightly nervous but determined. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." John smiled gently, gesturing for him to take a seat beside him on the porch. "Not at all, Brad. You're always welcome here." Brad sat down, fidgeting with his hands, glancing around as if unsure where to start. After a pause, he spoke. "I just wanted to talk, if that's all right. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, and I realize there's a lot I need to learn. I've spent my whole life seeing things one way, and now I feel like I'm trying to unlearn all of that." John nodded, his gaze calm and understanding. "That's the thing about change, Brad. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, and it takes a willingness to look at yourself honestly. But I'm glad you're trying." Brad looked down, nodding slowly. "I know I can't undo what I did, Mr. Carter, but I want to make things right. I've started volunteering at the community center, helping with some of the youth programs, trying to give back in any way I can. I don't know if it's enough, but it's a start." John placed a hand on Brad's shoulder. "It is a start, Brad, and that's what matters. The fact that you're willing to try means a lot, not just to me, but to everyone in this town. Change begins with one small step." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, each man lost in his own thoughts. Finally, Brad spoke again, his voice quiet. "I'm grateful for the chance to learn from you, Mr. Carter. I hope one day I can be as respected as you are in this town." John chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling with gentle humor. "Respect isn't something you chase after, Brad. It's something you earn by living with integrity and treating others well. Keep doing what you're doing, and respect will come in its own time." Brad smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in years. The shame and bitterness he'd once carried were slowly giving way to a new sense of purpose, one rooted in humility and a desire to grow. As he stood to leave, Brad extended his hand to John, who took it without hesitation. They shook hands, a silent promise passing between them, a commitment to change, to understanding, and to healing. Meanwhile, Michael continued to work tirelessly behind the scenes, advocating for policies that would benefit veterans and underserved communities. He had returned to Washington, but he visited the town regularly, checking in on his father and helping to oversee new community programs inspired by the Unity and Understanding event. One such program was the Carter Veterans Fund, established in John's honor, which provided resources and support for veterans and their families in the community. Michael worked closely with local businesses, schools, and nonprofits to ensure that veterans received the care, respect, and opportunities they deserved. The program quickly became a cornerstone of the town, a source of pride for everyone involved. Donations poured in from all over the region, and soon the fund had enough to offer scholarships, job training, and healthcare resources to veterans in need. John attended the opening ceremony, humbled and moved by the outpouring of support. During the ceremony, a young woman named Lydia, the daughter of a Vietnam veteran, approached John with tears in her eyes. "My father was like you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He was a proud man who always put others first, but he never received the kind of respect he deserved. What you've done here, it means everything to people like me and my family." John took her hands in his, feeling the surge of empathy. "Your father's legacy lives on in you, Lydia. And now, with this fund, we can make sure that every veteran, every family, gets the support they need." The impact of the fund was felt immediately, not only by the veterans it supported but by the entire community. For many, it was a way to honor the sacrifices made by those who had served, a tangible reminder of the town's commitment to respect and compassion. Over time, Millie's Place regained its former warmth and bustle, becoming a true gathering spot once again. The diner's reputation had been restored, not by brushing over the past, but by addressing it openly and moving forward with humility and grace. Millie herself had made a point of inviting John to the diner, and he often stopped by for coffee, sharing conversations with regulars who now treated him as a friend. Brad worked hard to build relationships with the customers he had once alienated, his actions speaking louder than words. He greeted each person with respect, making an effort to know their names, their stories. He even began hosting veterans' breakfasts on the first Saturday of each month, a free breakfast service for veterans in the community, which quickly became a beloved tradition. One Saturday morning, during one of these breakfasts, Brad found himself sitting across from John, who was sharing stories of his days in the service. The two men laughed and swapped stories, surrounded by other veterans who joined in, creating a camaraderie that warmed the entire diner. For the first time, Brad felt a sense of belonging, not because he was the diner's owner, but because he was truly a part of the community. As the months passed, The town continued to grow and thrive. Michael's efforts had sparked a wave of community-driven projects, including an initiative to address homelessness, a scholarship fund for underprivileged youth, and a cultural fair celebrating the town's diversity. The fair became an annual event, a day of music, food, and storytelling, where people of all backgrounds came together to celebrate their unique heritage. It was a testament to the town's transformation, a reminder that despite their differences, they were all bound by a shared desire for understanding and unity. At the first fair, John was honored with an award for his contributions to the town. As he accepted the award, standing on the stage before his friends and neighbors, he felt a surge of pride, not just in himself, but in the town that had embraced him, that had fought to become a place where everyone belonged. One evening, as the fair was winding down, John sat on a bench overlooking the town square, watching as families laughed and children played. He thought of his wife, who had passed years before, and felt a sense of peace, knowing that her spirit was still with him, guiding him through these moments. Michael sat down beside him, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "You did it, Dad," he said softly. "You helped change this town. You showed everyone what it means to live with dignity and compassion." John smiled, his eyes misty. "I didn't do it alone, son. You did this too. We all did. This town, it's as much yours as it is mine." Father and son sat in comfortable silence, watching the town they loved as it continued to grow, to change, to become a place of hope and acceptance. In that moment, John knew that his journey and the journey of the town had come full circle. They had faced the darkness of prejudice and emerged stronger, united by the bonds of forgiveness and understanding. And as the stars began to dot the night sky, John felt a deep, abiding peace, knowing that the legacy of love and resilience he had worked so hard to build would live on, not only in his son but in the community he had helped to shape. The end. This concludes the story, showing the lasting change that John and Michael's efforts brought to the town, and how forgiveness and courage can lead to a community's transformation. Let me know if there's anything else I can help with, or if you need another story.